Good day, everybody, and welcome to this session of Cloud Lunch and Learn. My name is Dwayne Nowick. I'm your moderator for today. And with me today is Phil Wilkins, and he is going to talk about API design. And if you have any questions throughout this session, if you're on YouTube, send your YouTube, LinkedIn, Twitter, welcome, and feel free to put any questions or comments in the comment section, and we'll make sure that we address them. And otherwise, Phil, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Lovely, thank you. Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, as they said in the film Truman Show. I hope you find this useful. So let me kick off straight away, and um, we'll get into some content. There we go. So this is me. Everything that you'll see or hear will be available through my own website, mp3monster.org. So don't worry about screen grabbing, recording, or anything like that. There's all the information is up there, or will be up there. This is an updated version of some material that I've been using on and off for some time. So I've got to upload it, but it will be there soon. I have written a number of books on both cloud native and Oracle-based technologies because I do now work for Oracle. Having joined them 6 months ago. So fortunately, if you're not an Oracle fan, then you're not going to be hearing much about Oracle. Today, we're going to talk about APIs and API payloads and things like that. In the most generic sense. So don't worry, no sales pitch going to be happening here. And let me move on. So just to cover my posterior, as we'd say in the UK, here's the disclaimer, just so that if my boss decides she doesn't like anything I've said, then I'm okay. But it shouldn't be the case. So the question or this title is an API more than a payload? Because when we do write APIs and work with APIs design, 90% of our effort goes into, maybe even more than 90% into working out the payload. So what is there other than the payload? So in this presentation, or these slides, I'm gonna focus on Open API specification. For those of you that are interested in messaging and things like that, we've got the async API specification evolving, which actually takes a lot of foundations from Open API. But even ignoring those, if you're not using those, you're using SOAP or WSDL, you're using GraphQL or gRPC. A lot of the points I want to get across here are still very, very applicable, even if the Open API spec is not directly relevant to you, because the underlying goals and objectives are common, or they're almost universal truths at their basis. So let's start looking at APIs and API definitions. There are a number of standards which we just mentioned out there. Open API specification, which is like the evolution on Swagger, and the open standard, rather than being owned by a single organization, is now pretty much the leading standard, but there are others out there. And there's some great documentation out there. But I just wanted to highlight a couple of points here. So this is a lovely visualization, and there's a great tool out there by Arnold Laureate, who's written for Manning, which actually allows you to navigate around the API spec to look at different aspects of it, and it gives you guidance on what's expected in different parts of the API definition. But when we actually work and describe our APIs, most of the time we end up working in these two areas. So describing the payload, perhaps giving some example values, describing the schema, so attributes and elements and their relationships, and what data types they are. And then of course we also think very much around the um, verbs, particularly the post get um, verbs uh, uh, to describe the operation in terms of create, update, and delete and read, or to use the acronym CRUD. But as you can see immediately, whilst I haven't fully expanded the view, there's a lot in here that we haven't looked at, and perhaps we should look at or think more about than we typically do. Certainly, in my experience, working with clients. Before I joined Oracle, I was working for a consultancy, and I spent a lot of time actually talking to development teams about their APIs, and often their questions actually came back down to discussing how to describe the bits that weren't in the core payload definition, the core schema, whether that's uh, you know a YAML description or a JSON description of the core. And as you can see, there's areas around describing the external documents, and we'll touch upon how valuable this can be. Um, we can talk about security and more widely on our overall API rather than on our individual operations, is the wider security. And then things like our contract and our licensing. Now, they may sound very boring, but actually there's a lot of important and useful stuff in there that really we can all relate to. And of course, lastly, we've got things like terms of service and the overall description. Um, Now, they don't sound very exciting, but they are, even for internal use cases, when we're working, sharing APIs with our colleagues, rather than trying to sell or generate revenue, important points. And I'll elaborate on why they're worth thinking about a lot more. Um, so let's just drill in a little bit. And one of these areas, the external docs and its related attributes, allows us to define additional properties and additional information on the operations and the API endpoints, which is particularly useful because there are some things that just can't really fit nicely into an API spec. And it's therefore, if we can reference out to another bit of content, and if we can customize the API schema to add some extra attributes that are unique to our use cases. Um, if, for example, you're defining and publishing APIs that are going to be working in a Kubernetes environment or a service mesh based environment, you might want to think about whether you want to expose open telemetry or open tracing in your header attributes. And you might want to therefore address that by extending the schema a little bit further in Open API, because it doesn't address directly those points today. The terms of service is largely a URL. So you can point to the terms of service, but the important thing here is by taking this one document, you can start to see a navigation out to all the ancillary information that you might want to put flash to that's important, even if that documentation is just a wiki page. And here's the security aspects of it. The security stuff, when you look at the high level details, it's not so obvious how to communicate it, which may explain why sometimes it's not as used as perhaps as much as it could be. Given that most APIs in this day and age, we've got some sort of security on there, even internally, um, with particularly when using cloud platforms and the idea of trust no one, you want some basic security. And we can see a little bit more elaboration on the security there. So what I did, because it's actually not as scary as it can look in the schema, I pulled out the part of the model that underpins this area, and you can see there isn't anything here that should be too scary for us. So we can say, look, here's an example. I am on this particular endpoint using OAuth. Really nice and simple and straightforward. And there's lots of other ways of communicating security, bearer tokens, keys, OpenID, basic oath, and so on. So it actually communicates a lot of information for very little effort. And if you're using API keys, um, then you can name the header attribute that you expect to see the key coming in. It makes life really easy, cuts down on documentation of um, writing down all of this information if you're using the Open API spec, because a lot of the information becomes implicit by the way you've incorporated it into your use of Open API. But does the API spec cover everything? I would argue no, and let me show you why. So one of the things I found really helpful over time is to convey the totality of what we want and need to use within um, the API landscape. And I created what I've called a little wall, um, which is like the headline areas or domains that, if you like, that we might want to consider. And at the end of this session, I'll actually show you an example which I could then take this wall and tick off each of these boxes. Um, Now, it's not just a case of this wall is built against one or two examples. This has been sort of accumulated experience and analysis of good APIs that are out there. Um, but it's pretty rich. And what you can see on this is that the bottom two tiers are very well uh, covered by Open API or any of the API definitions, syntaxes. You're going to be encouraged, and the structure should help you generate a good API, particularly if you've done your analysis of the data and use cases that you're trying to satisfy. But it gets weaker. The API specs get weaker when we look at all the other areas that people think about or might want or need when using APIs. Now, this particular view of the wall is geared up for external use cases. So even if you are not building uh, an API for monetization, as a business stream, a lot of this is going to be important to you. And even when you are working for internal use cases, as we'll see a bit later on, quite a lot of it is still very valid. And hopefully, as we go through, I'll try and explain some of the important areas of this. Um, but let's quickly just comment on the different sections. So, rules of engagement is all about who can use your API, how they use it, when they can use it, what they can expect from you, and what you expect of them. So, an external use case, that's if you're misusing our API, we're going to kick you off. We will block you from using our API. This is what we expect you to uh, do or not do. This is what we consider to be misuse, and that might actually get embodied in legal terms and conditions. Depending on your organization, some people are relaxed about it, others are not. Um, and some services you have to go through a process of accepting the legal T's and C's. Others sites you just find the URL and the API provider said you're on your own. If our API or service breaks, then so be it. We've talked about authentication authorization somewhat, um, but it goes beyond that because you need to get into, particularly if you're using OAuth and things like that, about how to connect the OAuth providers together, things like that. A lot of APIs, particularly when we're getting into mobile devices, a lot of good APIs will often give you a code framework or an SDK to make your life a lot easier. So no longer having to worry about writing the low-level code that's going to create a REST call or make a gRPC call for you. They'll give you a library. You can then just incorporate that library into your code, and that, from a development perspective, makes life so much easier, a lot faster. Obviously, there is the question of which languages do you support. Um, do I just provide a Java API? Have I got to provide Swift and Python and Go and so on and so forth? But the more you do that, the easier it is for your average developer to literally craft the invocation of your API into their application. Testing frameworks, well, testing frameworks are important because you don't want people trying to use your production environment when they're trying to test to make sure that they're using your APIs correctly and how they call them are in the manner you're expecting API calls to be made. So having that test framework to enable people to test their use, and conversely allow your internal applications to mimic the real system, um, so that you can test your specification and any changes to the specification that you need. You got documentation, um, and the consumer access to that information. There is a temptation to put documentation behind firewalls, or read walls, as it's sometimes referred to. Um, that has pros and that has some downsides as well, um, insofar as it makes your services less discoverable. Even internally, if you've got access restrictions, people are less likely to find your service and be able to go and dig in and understand what your API is available to do. And then, examples and use cases of using your API, illustrate how it can be applied to solving a problem. Because at the end of the day, uh, when someone's coming along and looking at APIs, they're not looking at the API for the fun of it. They're looking at APIs because they've got a problem to solve. So how can your API solve different problems? That makes life easier for the other developers or technical people or potential consumers of your service to understand and get in there quickly. I mean, at the end of the day, we're all pretty impatient. We all got a job to do and don't want to spend 2 hours trying to decide whether a REST endpoint will meet our needs or not. We want to get in there and start trying it and um, understand through exploration quite often. Now, we've just illustrated and talked about the external facing, um, and whilst we do, and a lot of organizations offer external APIs, a great many APIs start off as an internal solution, just a point of collaboration between teams or even between microservices if we're doing microservice-based development, or even just between applications if we're in the world of monoliths. But whether you're working internally for an internal facing connection or an external facing connection, the API definition and going beyond just the payload uh, is going to make your life a lot easier. At the end of the day, it's great doing the development, seeing an API go live, helping people get in and using it. But once it's up and running and it's into its sort of core life cycle, if you like, um, do we really want to spend our days answering little questions here and there, or do we want to move on to the next exciting thing? Because the API should be pretty robust and as an implementation and reliable. We want to move on to the next exciting green field more often than not. And what about the implications on my gateways? And how do the gateways that I use to protect my API impact the consumption of it? So um, one of the things that historically we've advocated, and I say we and myself, quite a few other people that have been evangelizing around the use of APIs, isn't just APIs for what's described as north-south, that's the public external facing, but also to use them internally for a whole raft of reasons, um, from use cases like just abstracting the back-end implementation so that if you're working with a legacy solution and you've got the opportunity to migrate it to microservices, if you publish your endpoints through a gateway, you can then start migrating your solution from one implementation to another. And all you have to do is repoint your gateway to your real solution, whether that's the new modern clean way of doing it or your legacy retained application. And the beauty is your consumers never know because the gateway is handling all the redirection, it's handling all the checks and balances, making sure that the request should be valid and legitimate for you. Um, in medium and large organizations, we quite often see our IT teams, particularly if we're aligned to different departments, have separated cost centers. So we then need to understand, well, who's using my service? If you would go and build an API that is intended for just one department, and then lots of other people would go, oh, that really helps me, and start using it, you might suddenly discover your systems are working a lot harder than you originally intended. Uh, Now, who's going to pick up the cost tab for that? If you're at least using the gateway to capture who's using it, when, where, how, you've got a better understanding of looking after your API. You know who to talk to communicate if you're going to take the service down. Um, you can then explore the ideas of charging across the departments for use of your service, which could then fund the improvements to your API. You could use it to measure to determine whether it's worth investing and improving the API anymore, or is it actually only such a niche use case that once it's solving the basics, then there's not much more point in investing and making it really the all singing, all dancing turbocharged solution that you hoped you would have. Um, and of course, it allows us to think about things like security and things like that. And none of these points really get captured in the API spec. You have to do it through referencing the documentation, through the engagement links, through the additional documentation references you can put in the API spec. And therefore, you need to find another way of communicating that, whether that's a knowledge portal, or a wiki, or a web page, or even just marked down in a Git repo. But your explanation and then being able to link to that information, it means that people are not going to be bothering you every 5 minutes about, oh, how do I connect? My credentials aren't validating. Um, how do I test my API against your endpoint without calling the production environment? Why is my API failing? I thought I could invoke your API using the information you provided, and the list goes on. Um, and whilst answering these questions are important, particularly in the early days of getting your API adopted, um, once you've got your first few users and use cases running, you really don't want to continue answering those questions time and time again. You want to get that information out there and let people fill their own boots. It's pretty exhausting answering lots of simple little questions, being disrupted when you're trying to get your head down and think your way through some new code, or you're trying to work through the design of a new API. If your Slack channel keeps pinging away every half an hour. So the other thing worth keeping in mind is the more information we put out there in a digestible manner, the more people can become self-service. Um, and whilst it's a commonly banded term, I think we all forget quite how often we prefer self-service. When you're going to get cash, how often do you go to the bank and the teller in the bank fees? Um, going to a cache point and a hole in the wall because it's so much easier, it's quick, it's convenient, you aren't waiting, um, you're not bound by the times that the teller is working, things like that. Um, you, most tools support many of these questions and needs now, so just tell people where to find the tools, and they'll go off and sort themselves out and only come to you if there is a really special case, which becomes a little bit more interesting because it's not been encountered before. It's a fresh challenge, uh, every developer I've ever worked with, and I include myself in that, loves a new challenge, loves something fresh, different. So coming back to the wall, I've talked about the externals. And this is what it looks like for internal. You see, there's not huge amounts of difference, yeah, because actually what we're trying to do is not that dissimilar. Yeah, if you're doing internal, you don't need the legals, you don't need the commercials because that's all sorted out within the organization. Um, Consumer access, you don't need to worry about that. You've probably got internal documentation services and things like that in this day and age. But we still potentially need to think about an SDK because an SDK, particularly if there's lots of different use cases involved, makes life so much easier. Um, you know, examples showing someone some code that uses your API, they can then go and grab and tailor or refactor your example. That's going to reduce the likelihood of them finding a weird edge case that you'd never expected, and that means your life is easier. So I'm hoping I've got your attention and you're probably agreeing with me that there is more to be found. So how do I solve some of these problems? How do I communicate these points and this information? Um, well, one of the ways to do it is to actually take something like that wall or create a checklist when you're within an organization and just zip through it. Now, I know um, I'm a little bit unusual, having been written books, that I'm not anti-writing. A lot of developers, you know, I don't want to write documents. Documents just get out of date and stale. We can create Java doc or the equivalents in Python and Go and things like that. So you can start using that to capture some of your documentation. Use Markdown in your GitHub or Git repo. That's easier than just going off writing chunky Word documents because Word documents do go and get stale. Um, and can be a bit laborious. Um, trying to keep the content concise and accurate is important, but we need to always remember that many of our consumers are not as close to the solution as we are. So many times an API will suffer from the fact that the developer will assume more understanding from the consumer than the consumer actually has. I was working with an API just the other day with this very problem. They'd assumed something that was not entirely obvious in the documentation. So I've gone back and said to the team, "Hey guys, I think you need to put into the documentation this little, simple statement, couple of lines explaining something, because that assumption is not obvious in what's there today." And it slowed me down because when I was looking at it, I was making what I thought was a reasonable assumption. Um, And of course, if you ask more than a couple of times, it's a common question, write it down, and you can point people to the description and let them sort themselves out. Um, and of course, it means that if you move on or you're trying to move on to a new project, then the easiest way to leave your current one behind is to leave it in a state where people are not dependent on you as an individual. And we can identify what's important in APIs, particularly with an API first model. um, where you're designing the contract. When you're designing the contract, you're going to be talking to the consumers or somebody representing the consumer, um, and agreeing um, all the information. They're going to be asking the questions up front before you've written any of the code. So you're going to be capturing those, even if they're captured as a requirement. So it becomes quite easy then just to address that as a question or as a bit of documentation going back. I've talked about the documentation and the value, particularly internally, and trying to enable people, enable colleagues. But APIs are becoming a commercial winner, and we might not think about it in the outset that APIs are going to be a key revenue source. But we've got these poster children for APIs. Expedia, for example, 90% of their revenue doesn't come through the website, comes through their APIs. Twilio, their website is really just a documentation portal for their service, which is APIs. eBay, likewise, massive chunks of their revenue are actually generated through eBay, through the APIs. So the getting them, getting your APIs done and documented well, and providing that extra detail makes it really easy for them to potentially become a source of revenue. And you never know, that could mean you become a bit of a superstar and maybe a manager of a new product, if that's what you want to get from it within your organization. If people suddenly realize that, hey, we could use this API publicly and get some money coming in that way. And that there are real genuine use cases and examples of that. Um, it's a bit dated now as an example, but Walgreens, when they re-engineered their in-store photo printing service, they built APIs on the store side. And for the fun of it, they published those APIs. And people suddenly started twigging into this and building their printing service directly into mobile apps for pictures. And all of a sudden, they had this huge revenue coming from a source they never expected because they'd made the service visible as an API. They were using the APIs initially as an internal story, and then just said, well, let's put it out there. We've done the hard work of building the API. Let's see what happens. PSD2 banking. PSD2 is a mandatory standard for banking organizations now. But all sorts of interesting business opportunities have popped up as a result. And I pulled this from a couple of points from a report in 2021 about the state of APIs. Top key factor in APIs, having better documentation. People using the APIs or evolving their APIs, 25 to 50%. And that number has only grown. Okay. If you don't accept those facts, look, here's just a few headlines, just how important they are. APIs are becoming to a business now. If APIs are important to the business, the better they are, the healthier, the better your business is. Here's some more facts and figures coming out of 2021. The documentation I mentioned. Oh, sorry, let me go back. But other factors coming in, the ability to improve collaboration and engagement within the teams comes up in so many ways as well in that report. And then in 2022 from Postman, they put API documentation as the fourth most important thing in terms of time. Yeah. Then another thing to keep in the back of your mind, 50% of consumers of APIs and API documentation are technical. That means 50% of your organization are non-technical, non-developer centric users. So just going, oh, read the code is not really going to be very helpful to that other 50%. Yeah. Now, some of those may be small numbers, CTO, CEO, network engineers, but that chunk there adds up to half of your readership, half your consumer base. So it's really worth putting the effort in and exploiting those extra features and getting that documentation in there. I'm not advocating documentation till kingdom come. Is just enough is fine, but you need to understand what just enough is, and reflecting on, hey, what do these other people potentially need, rather than just what do I think they need. And that number, as I say, the importance and investing more in APIs, 53%. Okay, so this is through Postman, so their audience is likely to be a bit biased. But another aspect of API definitions that we haven't addressed is how we change and how the APIs evolve over time. The API spec supports this, but it needs to be communicated what strategy we're going to use. And as Charles Darwin said, the only uh, truth is, or the reality is those that evolve and change are the ones that survive. It doesn't have to be the best or the ultimate. It's all about uh, who can change. And one of the things I did for a previous organization is we actually laid out a number of strategies, documented how those strategies should work, and then just said, okay, right, when an API is being documented, we'll just point to one of these strategies and say, that's how we're dealing with it. And there's plenty of good guidance out there about good APIs. So not only is it documentation, we need to ensure that we aren't doing anything daft. Um, and the OWASP, the Open Web Application Group, have had open web top 10 vulnerabilities for a long time now, but they now publish API vulnerabilities as well, and they're not too dissimilar actually. These are all common things that are wrong around APIs. Now, APIs, therefore, the API definition we need to address implementing good security, but also describing the security for our consumers. Um, and we can help ourselves here. Um, a lot of this all points to um, either going and home brewing or not using security facilities well. So if we go off and use a third party and refer and use their best practices for our APIs, we can just point to their best practices to say this is how an API should be done, but it also cuts down the amount of work for us. We're not having to code an authentication framework. We're just hooking into one that's proven and tested to kingdom come, and therefore we become not the person to be blamed when something goes awry. Unfortunately, not having a problem is very difficult to get fame and glory for, but it's a good thing. I've mentioned the SDK quite a bit already, and there's plenty of tooling out there. So if you get your API definition right, you can generate chunks of this code with tools, and that will save you a shed load of time. And then it's just a case of a little bit of extra documentation just to guide people into that generated code and where to look. And if your API has a particular pattern or model of use, then actually explaining that means you don't have to describe so much in the code, the SDK that you generate. So hopefully, I've convinced you of the value of looking beyond just the payload and the value you can gain from investing that extra time at looking at all those ancillary areas. Almost you could describe them as the non-functionals. So just to sort of underline some of the points I've been trying to make, I've taken a well-known API. In this case, I've gone to Google and Google Maps. We've all come across Google. And just going to point out the things that we've been talking about, just to highlight that I'm not selling this for the fun of it, or trying to get consultancy or trying to sell a product. People are doing it, and people are getting very effective use from it. So here you go, SDKs. Very strong, clear message there, and you can see actually 2 of the 3 SDK sections there in that bar are about enabling platforms. They've taken the time to go beyond just the payload and explain the overarching ideas. I talked about versioning. There's versioning. Yeah, talked about the concepts and ideas. There you go. They're the concepts and ideas there. Yeah, they've given you a bit more information about the data types than you could get into the schema easily. They've taken the time to try and understand the audience and explain what they assume that you'll understand. And so if people don't have that experience, either they need to have a book to hand, or they need to do something else to support that knowledge gap. They've talked about all those service use rules, quotas, pricing, the policies for using it, how we authenticate, self-service. So as you can see very quickly, straight out of the box, a couple of pages and the content's there, and you don't have to create reams of content to get a lot further than just that payload and make life easier. I mean, how many times do you think Google people are being bothered by questions about an API? Yes, it's a revenue stream for them, so there is a real value to the organization. But at the end of the day, the engineers are engineers, and we all like to get on and do the interesting, funky stuff rather than answering the same questions all the time. Right, now I started out saying I wasn't going to do an Oracle pitch, but I lied a little bit. Oracle got lots and lots and lots of free resources, not just on Oracle products, but on more broader stuff, your Java, Python, all sorts of programming languages, open source projects that they support. Oracle Cloud, there's a free tier, and there is also a eval trial tier period as well for the services that are more expensive, like AI. And if you reach out to me, if you reach out to me, to Oracle, then I can get you boosted to the $500 tier on the trial, so you can really play with some of the big toys. And as I say, lots of information on my website. There, the details. And let's see what we've got in the way of questions.
Yeah, Phil, I haven't seen any questions. I know we do have some people that are on the live stream, but apparently you've smashed it out of the park with your detail and all the information. So, but yeah, certainly everybody, anybody that here's a question. Are there any other books you would recommend? And you said you're going to put your slides up on your website, right?
Yeah, so I'll put the slides are on the website. It depends on what aspect of APIs you want. I'm biased. I've done work with Manning, but you saw the Arno's book briefly mentioned. There is, if you're trying to make the case for APIs and the process of getting an API initiative going, there's a brilliant book on Pact by Lewis Weir. Just to be clear, I used to work with Lewis, but I was the peer reviewer on the book, and he did a great job of explaining the ideas and the challenges and trying to get an organization engaged into the idea of APIs more generally, rather than it being just a sort of below the business line of this is what we do as engineers, and we think this is a good idea, so we're just going to do it. There's some patterns books out there that are quite good. I know one of them is on Manning. I'll put a little blog post on my blog to try and list all the books I'd suggest, if that helps. So keep an eye out on the mp3monster.org site, and that will go up as soon as I can compile the list.
Great. I don't see any other questions for anybody that is viewing this after the live stream. Feel free to reach out to Phil. He's got his contact information on here. I'm sure he's got comments section on his blog site as well. So and as well as comments on the YouTube video as well. We can grab those, but probably going to him on Twitter or other social media would probably be the quickest way to get a response if you have any questions, if you're watching this recording later on. But Phil, want to thank you for some great information around APIs and how to utilize them. So
brilliant. My pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity.
All right, everybody. Thank you for joining this Cloud Lunch and Learn session. And until next time, have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.